Okay, everybody, let's bring it back in. So I'm going to go through just a couple other things. We're going to start to look at shapes and stuff like that for, I guess, in Illustrator, how to make something more than just a line. What I'm looking at here is sort of a combination of two things. It's kind of symmetry-ish. It's close, but it's not quite there, so I'm not going to go for symmetry. I'm going to go for leading in this one. So anyway, leading is going to take a slightly different format. I don't have to set up any of like the rule of thirds or symmetry lines or anything like that. I guess I could set up one symmetry line, which is probably important enough. Let's switch to white, and let's make sure our stroke is not dashed, and let's make sure it's thin. And I am unable to draw on this layer. Why? What am I missing? Oh, I'm not on the layer. That's why. Okay. So I'll draw my horizontal line. Okay, so you've got some horizontal symmetry, but you don't have vertical symmetry, and that's fine. What I'm going to do is start off with just kind of a simple dot right in the center of the projection, and then we're going to sort of show the radial for where it's leading. In this case, it's a one-point perspective, so I'm going to diagram the one-point perspective. One thing I'm going to do is let's stick with white lines on this one. It should be fine. I'm going to switch it to a one-point line, and I'm going to make it a dash line. And I'm going to draw right along the edge of the walkway cover, awning, whatever you want to call it. And I'm going to drop a line there. And then I'm going to draw another line from exactly the same termination point up the edge of the other one. Let me pull this line back a little bit. Actually, on that point, notice how I drew it a little bit long. Illustrator is a little funny with how it draws lines, because even though it's a vector software, it doesn't really draw the line necessarily from point to point in terms of identifying it as an object. It still identifies it as an object with like a box that goes around it orthogonally relative to the sheet. So I sort of have to grab the corner, like unlike Illustrator or Rhino, where you would just grab the endpoint and pull it somewhere. Now I have this like box thing that I have to drag around, and it's going to change where my line goes. It doesn't change the proportion of the line, that's fine, but it does change where it goes. So I'm going to click and drag and just kind of pull it down on there. You don't have to hold shift or anything like that. So that's one part of it, and then I'll do the same thing from the same vanishing point. This part's a little more difficult because you have a few options. You can actually diagram literally any object in this construct, but you've just got to be very careful that you're doing it in a very, I guess, responsible way. So choosing the best one can be difficult. You can choose the handrail, which I don't really like where it's going. It's a little off on the handrail. You can choose the edge of the travertine, or you can choose the edge of the walkway. Whatever you want to do, all of that's fine with me. Okay, so that's our diagram, right? It's a one-point perspective, and it goes to a vanishing point. So I'd like to put a point that really shows that there is one spot in this diagram that everything is emanating from. Yeah?
How about the shape? Hatch the part and it's like change the transparency.
For what?
Leading you look at that point.
Yeah, okay. Oh, you're talking about the triangle underneath. Yeah, you could do that. I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. So anyway, all I was going to do is use the ellipse tool. There is no circle tool. An ellipse is just a circle is really just an ellipse that is square in its circumscribed, form. So when you're drawing a little circle, you can draw an ellipse just by free-forming it, or if you hold shift, it'll be square and it'll make a circle. So I'm going to do it pretty small. You don't want to overwhelm drawings with super, super heavy graphics. Like I said, we're doing these really fine lines over our image, and it's communicating just as well. So I'm going to pick a very small circle. We have a white stroke, and it's actually a dashed stroke, so I need to turn that dashed stroke off. Actually, let me leave it on for a sec. I'll show you why we turn it off. And then I'm going to change the fill to a white fill. So I'm going to zoom in, and let's pull this thing down to the center, and let's zoom in on it a little more. Okay, so something funny is happening. Notice how it has these like little jagged edges? That's because that is the dashed stroke. So if I turn off that fill, it's a dash, right? So a stroke is the center line of the object itself, right? The center line of the stroke is on the center line of the object. So you either want to fill it and then make sure that you don't have a dashed line, or you can completely take off the stroke altogether and it will be a completely inscribed fill. Does that make sense? Okay, so I think that that's smart to do. There we go. All right, so that is lines and shapes. But the question came up, thank you, Allison, for the question, is how do you make a fill, right? So in like an odd object. So it's a little different than you might expect. What you can do is draw a series of lines, or you can draw a full object using like not a star tool. Where's it? I haven't used this in a while. I just forget where the tool is, but you could just line by line and then do it. But anyway, all you need to do is go from anchor points to anchor points and just complete the object, right? So that one, that was a no stroke, so let me put that stroke back on there. So now I've got a line here, a line there, and a line here. All of those lines are connected at their endpoints. So what you can do in order to create a fill for that is select all three. And when you try to create a fill, you'll notice that it's not going to do anything, right? Even though I changed it to a white fill, it's not going to do anything. So what you have to do is create an object out of these, right? So they're just three separate lines. You need to go to Object and go to Live Paint and click on Make. Okay, that's going to allow you to paint within this object that you're creating. So the tool, and I always forget where it is in the toolbar, I just know the hotkey, is K, and it's this little paint buckety thingy. Oh, there it is right there. Huh. So it's right there, apparently, the little paint bucket with a little square. That's your live paint bucket, hotkey K. So when you click, it's, well, oh, I still have the white stroke. So make sure you fill it with something, and then click inside of it, and it's going to do that. So that creates an object that you've created the boundaries for, but you need to make sure that it's translucent so that it still communicates what you want it to communicate. So you go up here to opacity and you bring it down. Something like that. Now, the downside of doing that is that the stroke also, if you create a live paint group, the stroke also gets caught up in that as well. So I like to turn off my stroke on the object, and then I draw in my lines over top of it. So if I want to redo that, I'll just do the line tool, go back to white, turn the fill off, turn my dash line on, and then just redraw from this anchor point to here. Okay, and there you have it. There's our diagram. What questions do you have? All right. So there's one more. This one right here, and I'm just going to kind of throw it out there. I have no idea whether or not this is actually a valid diagram, but I sort of have two ideas about this, and this is just really sort of throwing paint on the wall. So this is an image balancing thing. So what I'm going to try and diagram is how much of the real estate of the image is effectively taken up by the objects within it, the two primary objects, meaning the sculpture in the front and the building in the back. Now, I don't count the entire building as being effectively taking up real estate. I think only the parts that are really truly capturing your attention are the key component to this particular diagram. So what I'm going to do is create a ellipse that just sort of balances the objects in that frame. But I think first, let me make sure I frame out how big the image is itself for when we turn that off later. So I'm going to do a box around that. Let's make it black, and let's turn off that stroke. There. Okay, now there's a black box around it, so we really know what the image frame is. Okay, so I'm going to go to my ellipse, and I'm going to do basically just two simple things. I'm going to create an ellipse around the object itself, and in this particular case, I actually think the entire extent of the object, sort of balanced out by like a NURBS curve sort of level of extension, is appropriate. So I'm going to switch this to, and I'm going to use color now. So I'm going to use something that actually is very bold because, you know, what I was talking about before, the image was the primary component, but in this case, the diagram is the primary component, or it's going to become the primary component. So while it's over the image, I'm going to drop the opacity of this thing down like that. Okay. So we've got object in the foreground that shows. To me, it feels like it covers about that much real estate in the image. And then we're going to have another one, and that's the building behind it. So on a very similar note, I'm just going to copy and paste that. And because the building actually extends far beyond what I think is the effective area of what's capturing your attention, I'm going to focus on the facade where it's in the sun. And that's going to be over here. So I think that's the primary part of the architecture in this image. And I'm going to switch the color of that one to black. Okay. This one, I actually want to put this one in front. All right. So that is my diagram. Believe it or not, that's a diagram. It communicates an idea. All right. So what questions do you have so far before I go into like the next part of this thing? None. Yeah.
So what is exactly this diagram trying to show?
So this diagram is trying to show how much real estate each object is getting on that particular image. So this is an image balancing exercise, right? We talked about balancing before, right? Let me pull up a... Yeah, so I mean, I could do a real quick one on this, right? So this image is trying to balance the mass of two things that are happening at two different depths within the field. So I'm going to copy this. Let's put this in Illustrator, paste it, put it here, go up there. Yeah, I'll just make it bigger. Oh, I can't make it bigger. Go here. All right, so let me create a new layer. Arrange, send to current layer. Okay, so here, this is the same principle. Let me go back to the previous diagram and just grab the same two elements. Put them on this layer. Okay, so we've got an object down here. Like that, and then we've got an object up here. Whoops. Like that. All right, So with image balancing, what I'm trying to diagram is essentially, hang on a sec, let me pull, I got to create a new layer for the box. Let's go here. Current layer. And I'll create a new one for the diagram. That's this. All right. So effectively, what I'm trying to diagram is basically that. That's the diagram. How much real estate is being taken up in the image, and in reality, this one's actually a little smaller, so it's more like that. But how much real estate is being taken up within that frame by the two objects within the frame? Yeah. So that's the diagram of what that is. Any other questions? Yeah.
The definition of real estate.
The definition of real estate. So when I say real estate, I'm talking about like, you know, think of the Monopoly board, right? Or not even the Monopoly board. That's dumb. Think of like, you know, a city grid, right? How much real estate do you own? So if I broke this thing down into blocks and streets and all this other stuff, you know, grid basically. Let's say the grid. If you broke this down into a grid, how many of those blocks do you own? How much real estate do you have? So that's, I mean, it's a simple way of just trying to get those two to relate to one another, I guess. It's just an analogy. Okay. Yeah.
What kind of diagram would you suggest if I'm trying to show
Framing.
framing?
Yeah. I mean, a framing diagram might look something like this, very similar to the diagram I already drew.
Oh.
You know, I would say you could do it that way, or if your framing is a little bit more orthogonal, you might want to diagram it by showing, you know, your axes. Like you can show where exactly the frame occurs. If it's even, right? Or if you're framing it on the third line, then you can sort of balance it toward your third mark and show that frame that way. Remember the image that I showed you guys about the Eiffel Tower? Or not the Eiffel Tower, geez, that was dumb. From the Empire State Building looking downtown. They were looking through the fencing, and the fencing was sort of doing this kind of thing. I have no idea what the actual triangle was or whatever. But it was like that, and that was the framing. Something like that. Okay. What's that? I didn't understand. Oh, unusual viewpoint is a little different. That I don't know that you can really diagram that very well. What you might want to focus on with unusual viewpoint, let me try and find... hang on. Okay. All right, so here's one. So here's an image, unusual viewpoint. What I would probably try... There we go. All right. So I think what I would probably try and do with unusual viewpoint is try and find something else that you can speak to about it. So if it's looking up, you can start to, you know, show where the axes are going to draw from. All right, where did those go? There we go. You know, something like that already is an unusual viewpoint because the center point of it is in a totally unpredictable location on the frame. You know, and you could put your dot there and show that. Does that make sense? All right, cool. So the other thing I wanted to talk to you about real quick is how this translates to other diagrams. So if you need to try and communicate things in a thumbnail fashion, right? Rather than overlaying your image, how do you do that? And this is more intriguing than the rule of thirds one, so I'm going to use this. But your diagram for your photography, or in essence, the concept of your building, in this case, could very well be what you see here. So I'm going to draw another layer, and I'm going to drop all of my components on it. Let me do it this way, actually. I'll turn that off for a sec. I'll just grab everything, turn that off. I'm going to go to this layer and say send to current layer. Cool, it's all gray. Oh, the image is not supposed to be on that layer, so go to, yeah, send that back. There we go. Okay, so let's turn that off for a sec. Let's grab all of these and let's make them black. Okay, that's your diagram right there. That's your building's conceptual diagram. Through representation, at least. Right? So basically what happens, how does this relate to our design process, right? Whatever your design diagram is, makes its way back into how you frame your imagery and your renderings. So you can literally take your design concept, right? Like when you guys present your projects in design, you have a diagram something like this, right? Like if your concept is triangulation, whatever the case. And then you can literally paste it as an overlay into, like, you know, Photoshop, and then align your renders to it. It strengthens the overall concept and sort of drives home what it is you're trying to achieve in your design through its representation. Okay, so you guys are like hitting your like, you know, middle rising climax of this class, right? So now we're gonna have some like tumultuousness. You guys know the story arc triangle thing, like rising action, falling action, resolution, that kind of stuff, right? So you guys are hitting that like middle point where like you get a little high point in the middle and then it dips because we gotta, you know, go through a lot more to get to the next level, and then we're gonna get up to the, you know, climax right before final, and then your falling action and resolution is gonna be your feedback from your final review, right? So I'm hoping that you guys are very excited about this, because this, like, we're right at the midterm. This is like the crux upon which all of our conversations are going to be built going forward. How does representation relate to design? Thoughts, comments, questions, concerns, condolences? As always, yeah.
Should we have? I mean, it is better for have a simple diagrams and stuff like that.
Is it better to have a simple diagram? Is that what you're saying?
Is it much better to have more information in it? Or
No. So I like simple. Simple diagrams are all you need to communicate anything. Basically, the simpler diagram that you can possibly make, the more clear your message is going to be, and the more successful your design is going to be. I think that's mostly true of all design concepts, because if it doesn't communicate, it's not successful. Like this communicates.
So isn't like not showing the picture on the background? Because the picture actually makes it look.
Yeah, I mean it relates to that, you know, and I could probably conceptualize something that pulls the process back from the other direction, which is the way you should be using it. But actually, you know, let's all right. Let's say your design concept was using the golden ratio. Do you guys know what the golden ratio is? Raise your hand if you do. Most of you. I'm surprised at how many of you knew what the golden ratio was and didn't know how to use Illustrator. The golden ratio, it's this. Yeah, right, that one's a little bigger. There you go. So the golden ratio. Let's say your concept was using the golden ratio to create space, right? It's a sort of semi-spiraling mathematical formula that creates really interesting, I think, relationships between different scales of spaces, right? And design concept-wise, you could pull that into architecture a multitude of different ways. You could use the ratios of the squares to rectangles, which is what most architects have done since the Renaissance on, even before then. Or you can actually literally use it as points of view. For instance, this. That is the golden ratio in essence, right? You could design stairs or something to at some certain viewpoint to be a golden ratio, and then literally lay the diagram over it and say, here you go, here's your golden ratio. So that's the kind of thing I'm referring to. Like if that is your design diagram and it relates directly to the architecture that you've created, then you can find that viewpoint in your model and literally represent it as such. Does that make sense? Yeah. Now, I shy away from saying literal because in architecture you don't want to use literal references too much. But that's the clearest way that I can communicate the use of conceptual diagrams become representational diagrams. Only half of you were looking at that. I thought that was pretty profound. But anyway, so I hope that makes sense. I hope it's motivational. I hope it's informational. So I think you should spend a minute internalizing that, and then we'll go on to some other things in a little bit.